Welcome back. Now, I want to just demonstrate some more practical steps that you might go through to deploy the Maestro environment. So first, I'm going to log into my Orchestrator. It's already been cabled. I have used the serial interface to set the management interface's IP address. And again, you'll note that this looks very much like any other Gaia web user interface, except it has this extra orchestrator menu entry over here. And clicking on orchestrator, if I get a pop-up error message about communicating with the orchestrator, the most probable cause of that, the most common reason you see that is that you are in a one orchestrator deployment. The orchestrator appliances ship expecting to be in a dual deployment. So you have to go into the CLI of the orchestrator and change the orchestrator number or count to 1. And then you should not see that error message here. Excuse me. So next I'm going to create a security group. Key in the information. And I will go ahead and set up the first time wizard as well. And I'm not going to create this as a VSX Gateway Security Group. So the security group has been created, but it requires at least one security gateway module be assigned and at least one management interface be assigned. And again, I have to be very careful where I drag and drop the gateway objects from the unassigned gateways, because if I try to drag it somewhere else, it doesn't accept it. It's sometimes a cause of confusion. So I've populated it with 4 security gateway modules. I'm also going to add management interface and some additional traffic interfaces. Next, I'm going to create VLANs on the traffic interfaces. It's repeating for all of these interfaces, creating VLAN interfaces. So the 101 and 102 VLANs are ultimately going to be internal networks, and the 201 and 202 VLANs are ultimately going to be external networks. This sort of thing might actually go faster via the command line interface. So I've created 2 VLANs each on the 4 uplink interfaces that I've assigned to this security group. Now I'm going to apply the security group settings. And this will do many things. It will send the security group configuration out to those appliances. Those appliances will receive the security group information, configure themselves, and then restart themselves to reflect the fact that they are now in a security group with these interfaces and this configuration. So those security gateways are going to be restarting themselves, and I'll pause and then continue when the security gateways are back up. So at this point, the security gateways are back up and the security management object is answering the security group's IP address so I can connect to it with the web user interface. And used the default password admin to log in. Go ahead and make some setting changes. Perhaps in a production environment, you wouldn't have the timeouts be this high, but in this environment, that's what I'm doing. So now I want to set up the network interfaces a little bit more. I have the 4 network interfaces that were assigned to this security group in the Orchestrator web UI. I want to bond interfaces together. I'll create another bond for the other pair of interfaces. And I want to create VLANs on each of those bonds. So there'll be a total of 4 VLANs. So next, for each of those VLANs, I'm going to set up IP addresses. It's working through them all. last one. So now all of the bonded interfaces are participating in VLANs, and I've assigned each VLAN its own IP address. I did that now in the security group's web user interface before I open SmartConsole and start creating the object that will represent this security group. Now in SmartConsole, yes, I will create the security group object to represent this security group, and it's going to be a so creating a gateway object to represent the security group in policy. Establish SIC. Now that SIC is established, topology of the security gateway will be automatically fetched and populate this object's network management screen. And I'm going to install a simple policy. This policy is a modified cleanup rule, always matches, accepts, and logs the traffic. So some things to note, even though that there are 4 security gateway modules assigned to the security group, it's represented by that single management object at the IP address that I assign to the security group. And so there is no need to create a cluster object or create multiple gateway objects. In the previous demonstration, I created one security group using uplink interfaces from one orchestrator. Here I'm in a dual orchestrator deployment, and I'm going to set up 2 security groups and use uplink interfaces from both orchestrators. So if an orchestrator has an issue, we have high availability. So first I'll create the security groups and populate the single management object information. Set up the first time wizard. Not install as VSX. I'll go ahead and create the second security group while I'm here. And the first time wizard, second security group. And not as VSX. Now I will allocate half of my security gateway modules to one security group and the other half to the other security group. And I will start adding management interfaces. Note that I can reuse the management interface. Now, I probably should have management interfaces from both orchestrators, but I'm not going to do that right now. And for the second security group, and now I'm going to set up VLANs. And continuing. So I have 2 pairs of uplink ports assigned to security group 1, and each pair has a pair of VLANs. Later on, I will bond the pairs together. And I do the same thing in the second group, security group. And one last set of VLANs to create. 1, 0, 2 next. So I have on both orchestrators used uplink ports from those 2 orchestrators in both security groups. And by bonding them later in the security group's web user interface, I have high availability between the 2 orchestrators. If one fails, connectivity is still possible. So I will apply the changes that I've made. It will take a little bit to think about. And once it's done validating and applying the new topology, I'll get a report. I'll pause until that report is ready. So the report, the summary is available and it looks very nice. Now the security groups have their configuration. The security gateway modules are applying the configuration and restarting. And when that process is done, then the single management object for each security group will be responsive to web user interface connections. So I'll pause until that's ready. So at this point, the security groups have been created. Security gateway modules have restarted and the single management object is available. So I'll log in to the web UI of the first security group. And do just a little bit of configuration. Now I want to configure the interfaces here in the single management object. What I'll be doing is first creating bond interfaces. And then I'll create VLANs on top of those bond interfaces. That's the first bond interface. So I've configured the bond interfaces. Next, I'm going to give them IP addresses. Verifying that they are indeed enabled. So I've created two bonds. I've created two VLANs per bond. I've configured IP address of each of those VLANs. Next, I'm going to Do the same on Security Group 2. So you may have seen that there was an error copying the config, propagating the config to the other members of the security group. So I paused, and it turns out that of the 6 security gateway modules, the first 4 are up and running. One is unresponsive, and I don't know if it has power or not. The other is not in a healthy state. So rather than deal with all that drama, I redistributed the security gateway modules via the Orchestrator web user interface, and now each security group has 2 security gateway modules. And that's the beauty of Maestro. The fact that I reallocated resources doesn't show up in the single management object, and it won't show up in policy or SmartConsole. So that adds a lot of flexibility. So again, here I want to start creating bond interfaces and then VLANs on those bond interfaces, and then create or add IP addresses. So going through all 8 iterations of this. At this point, it's 4 iterations. So I have 2 VLANs on each bond interface. Now I want to set IP addresses. More drama. Continuing setting up the VLAN interfaces. Well, turns out computers are very specific. So finally, I have two bonds created with two physical interfaces per bond. And then on top of the bonds, I've created two VLANs per bond. Next, I'm going to bring up the SmartConsole application and create objects represent both security groups. And typing is obviously very difficult. So now I have created this security gateway object that's using a single management object of security group 1. And when I established SIC, it was able to pull over the topology, reflecting what I had just configured in the web user interface. Do the same thing for the second security group. Establish SIC. Once again, topology will be fetched. I also wanted to point out the platform hardware was updated to Maestro, and the version is R80.20 scalable platform. Next, I'll install a very simple policy. It's still the modified cleanup rule that allows everything. And policy installation is underway. I'll pause until policy is installed. At this point, policy has been successfully installed to both security groups, both single management objects. And again, I can access the Orchestrator command line or web user interface and shuffle around the assignments of the individual security gateway modules. Perhaps some of them are faster appliances, more powerful appliances than others. I can shift them around in response to load. Of course, when I do that, there will be a brief time when they're not managing any connections. It is possible that in a future release of the Maestro environment, scalable platforms, that you will be able to designate some of the security gateway modules to be floaters. I don't know exactly what the terminology will end up be, but unassigned security gateways can be automatically, dynamically added to security groups based on rules that you define. If the load is above this point for this long, then add a security gateway. If it falls below this point for this long, take the security gateway out. Dynamic shifting, dynamic balancing of resources. It's not currently yet available, but it's sort of on the roadmap, and we'll see which version that feature shows up in, if any. So I've demonstrated using both orchestrators for failover, for high availability, by creating security groups that consist of uplink ports from both orchestrators. And of course, the security gateway modules must have downlink connectivity to both orchestrators for this to actually be high availability. Next, I'm going to demonstrate security groups using VSX, Virtual System Extension.